It's going to be great.
Great. So I guess I will introduce this panel. So today, Bad Activist Collective is hosting this panel in collaboration with Global Day of Climate Action and Pass the Mic. So today, Fridays for Future is protesting globally to demand climate justice. And they're focusing on policy, using the hashtag No More Empty Promises, and trying to call for concrete and immediate action in line with science, and demand the people in charge to prioritize annual short-term climate binding targets that factor in justice and equity. So yeah, I guess today we'll just have a laid-back chat between all of us guys here and talk about how we want to move forward for an inclusive climate justice movement. So I guess I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Like maybe I should start. I'm Danielle Sams. I'm moderating this panel today, and I'm a neuroscientist and what do I do? Always do this. I'm a research assistant in cognitive neuroscience. And also an intersectional climate and social justice activist. I'm from London, but I live and work in Germany, and I work with Pass the Mic Climate, Health Future Mag, the blog, and also a educational platform called Reeducate. So I'll pass to Ayshka, and you can pass on to whoever you want from there.
Awesome, thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Ayshka. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm based in the UAE. I work with Fridays for Future Digital, Fridays for Future MAPA, and Fridays for Future International, mainly press and support a lot of digital campaigns and all the digital aspects that goes behind the climate movement and climate campaigns. I also work with Pass the Mic. I'll pass it on to Sofía.
So hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Pass the Mic and Bad Activist Collective for inviting us. So just a quick bio about myself. I'm Sofía Hernández. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Costa Rica. I'm 22 years old. I am a political science student about to graduate finally. So I'm also a human rights activist. I basically started doing activism without knowing. Both of my parents, they are political activists. So I remember going to strikes and protesting as I was like 7 years old. So I've been doing this for a long time, but I think I started like doing activism, like maybe calling myself an activist, I don't know, at some point, since about like 2 years when I joined Friday for Future. And yeah, that's me. 2 years ago, I also had the opportunity to go to COP25, and since then I've been doing not only like activism here in Costa Rica, but now I'm part of, Friday for Future International, MAPA, doing some stuff with Castle Agreement here in the region, and also with Pass the Mic. And I will pass it on to Destiny.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all. It's nice to share space and share energy with you all. My name is Destiny Hodges. I am the founder and co-executive director of Generation Green. I'm an environmental liberation organizer, and I'm also a junior interdisciplinary communications major at Howard University. I'm based in the US. I'm 20. My pronouns are she, her. And in the context of my work, especially with Generation Green, I focus on environmental liberation, which is a movement for and by Black people globally across the African diaspora, and affirming that climate justice, environmental justice, and Black liberation are inseparable and must be achieved together, and that Black liberation is liberation for everyone. So really focusing on the intersections of Black liberation, climate, environment, land, and place. I'm also the assistant producer and marketing coordinator for the award-winning Climate and Culture podcast, The Coolest Show out of Hip Hop Caucus. And I'm just really excited to be here with you all today. So I will pass it to Dominique.
Hey guys. Hey, really excited to be on here today. I'm Dominique. I'm a climate justice activist based in England. I'm an organizer in Fridays for Future International and the launch and press coordinator for Climate Live, an event that's happening this year with concerts taking place in over 40 countries to unite for the climate. My work is really focused on organizing climate actions and strikes, mobilization, and engaging in like policy and policymakers, and really just engaging people into the climate movement and working on various different international campaigns. And for me, I'm all about campaigning for bold and systemic change from our global leaders, because that's really what we need to fight the climate crisis, and really focusing on intersectional climate justice, which is so crucial. And that we're not only fighting for our futures, but for people already being impacted by the crisis, and also for communities that will be disproportionately impacted as well. So that's really a massive focus for me in my climate activism.
Amazing. Thank you guys all so much for introducing yourselves. I'll get straight into like the conversation we're going to have. It's going to be mostly about you guys and your work. So I guess generally, how did you, if you haven't already covered it in your introduction, how did you get into your activism? What's the journey been like for you? We're all from very different like backgrounds. So how does your identity intersect with your work and influence your work? I'll start with Dominique.
So for me, I've always been more like aware of like, the environment, and that, there is kind of a climate crisis, but I wasn't really aware of the severity of it until about 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago. And that's when I started getting more involved. But also what really kickstarted my activism for me was that around the time I was very kind of engaged with like human rights, for example, and seeing the connection between the climate crisis and its impact on human rights and its impact on people is what really got me into it. And also, I lived in one of the most polluted areas in London, and I started to see posters around my area at that time of people talking about, people who had been affected by air pollution, and realizing and researching on how communities of colour in the UK are, the most impacted by this as well. And so just connecting that kind of justice and climate justice aspect of it as well to the climate crisis, and seeing how all of that just interconnects. And that's when I really kickstarted my activism. And I went to my first climate strike and then got involved from there. And I've just been engaging in lots of different things from there. So whether that be like strikes or actions, or working on press, or coordinating a team for this, or going to events and speaking like COP26 and doing actions there, or engaging in policy, just kind of like a range of different actions all towards systemic change.
Yeah, I definitely think people born like in the UK and maybe just global south generally were always taught to think about the climate crisis as like, oh, it's just the polar bears are dying in Antarctica. It's never going to affect you. It doesn't affect people. It's all right. The water levels are just going to rise and we might be flooded, and that's all we ever really hear. So I think that's really interesting how you speak about your experience, especially being from London as well. Destiny, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think for me, I have to start off by saying that I don't identify as an activist, and I don't necessarily identify with activism. And I think activism can be many things. It can be spontaneous, it can be planned, it can come in many different forms, whether that's, striking online, whether that's having an art piece or having a brand that focuses on pushing a message. Activism can be many things, and oftentimes because it can be so many things, it can be skewed. There can be performative activism, celebrity activism, but I personally identify as an organizer, in that, in the way I move and the way I work is very strategic. It's very goal-oriented. It's very community-oriented. And it's not just showing up for the moment. And I'm not saying that every person who identifies as an activist only shows up for the moment, but it's clear and it's very important to make a distinction and to say that I'm not in this work for a year. I'm not in this work for a moment. I'm in this work for my life, because it is my livelihood and the livelihood of my community that I fight for. And so therefore, I identify as an organizer, not an activist. But in the context of how I got into this work, particularly as it pertains to environment, and when I say environment, I'm focusing on the environmental justice definition of environment. So I'm including my Black body, my skin as an environment, and anything I come into contact with that, affects me and the way I move about the world, and even empowers me or disempowers me, or disables me to be able to move about that. I've always loved National Geographic, Animal Planet. Spent all my childhood. That's literally all I watched, y'all. Got banned from some shows. I would cry and scream at the TV. And I've always been a writer. I've always loved poetry. I've been a journalist for years. And watching National Geographic, Animal Planet, and all of these, publications or documentaries, they started to talk about climate change. And so I learned about climate change at a young-ish age. But the only way I was introduced to it was through physical elements of environment when it pertains to landscape and wildlife. And I never saw people. Or, when I did, it was people talking about the crisis, but they were white. And, I was like, well, what about people who look like me? Where's the coverage of us and how we're affected? Because in many cases, when we're talking about wildlife, specifically the ocean was a huge thing that was covered. But I'm like, what about the people who live on the coast? This has to be affecting them too. This has to be affecting, their ecosystem, their food, their economy, considering tourism, like fisheries, et cetera. And once I got to college at Howard and realized that there was a name for what I was referencing, which was environmental justice, I was like, oh, wow, this is what I want to do. This is the work that I want to do. And I want to use, my skills and my love for storytelling to do that. And then as going through that, I realized, oh, wow, this movement is very white, very, very white. And it silos folks and it silos identities, which you touched on that, and different fights. And so my brain doesn't work like that. I'm really naturally intersectional. I'm a weaver. I connect everything. And that's why academia has been a mess for me. But and so I was like, okay, well, even in the context of EJ a little bit, that kind of doesn't allow me to move as fluid as I like to. And so in Generation Green, being in a community of Black women and femmes, just talking about what is environment and where does Black liberation intersect with that, and then kind of synthesizing and reimagining environmental liberation and moving into that. And that's what I've been working through since.
I just want to ask you, following up on calling yourself specifically an organizer, and I think, yeah, that's great, no problem. But do you think also the term like climate organizer or just organizer in the sense of organizing for a kind of political goal can also become skewed like activist?
Oh, absolutely. Both of them can become skewed. I don't think folks know the difference. And so that's why I was trying to make the difference and noting that one is not, one can be many things, and it can be especially spontaneous, but one is very strategic, one is long-term, one is invested, one is community. It's goal-oriented and it's evolving. And so I think that's the distinction, but they can both very easily become skewed. People, identify with both, but might not know the meaning. But it's important to look at history and look at other organizers or other activists and pay attention to how they identify themselves and the work that they did. And then compare that to where we are now in this 21st century where everything's digital and popularized and trendy. And then look, I was like, how are people showing up then? How are people showing up now? And, what is my role in this?
Amazing. All right, Sofía, do you want to go next?
I think I already said a bit about how I got involved with climate activism and organizing. I should say that I think I'm like both at some point. For example, sometimes, like you said, we sometimes do very spontaneous things, like what is happening today. Like this is something very spontaneous. But for example, when I say that I'm part of this discussion agreement process, it's not a one thing, one spontaneous action. Basically, what we're doing with the discussion agreement is not only to promote the agreement to countries to ratify it, it's also to communities to understand the importance. We're talking about, I don't know, this is part of my identity, even though I'm not being threatened, but Latin America is a very complex region, and it's a very unequal region. Basically, here in Costa Rica, you can see we have this highway. So from this side, you see a lot of like Gucci, Chanel, and all those expensive, places. And then from the other side, you see basically marginalized communities. And this is how unequal is the region. And when we talk about like defending, to defend the environment, here Latin America is the most dangerous region to be an environmental defender, also with the Philippines. So when we talk about this agreement, discussion agreement, what the discussion agreement wants to and is like talking about is to ensure climate justice, environmental justice, to stop ecocides, to have public participation, to have information to environmental matter. Basically, is to the states, the government, and the society has this obligation to not only protect the environment as our source of we without nature we don't exist. Like we need water, we need land, and we need to coexist with this. I would say like balance relationship. Even though we are not living with this balanced relationship, we are not only like destroying the nature, but also we are seeing that we have more communities than other communities being affected, and this is a structural and systemic exclusion that is not only perpetuated by us, I would say, as society, but also the system, how governments work, how the states work, and this is what how it's considered very important. We are not only asking for its ratification. We need that agreement to exist, that we have all the mechanism, the justice mechanism, we have all the platforms. For example, you can't basically have this idea that indigenous community here from Costa Rica or from the Amazonians, they will have a full access to digital information. We also need to translate those, I would say, documents. And this is something that is very important about the agreement. Well, I say that I basically, before doing activism or doing organizing stuff, I was already doing some stuff. I'm part of an academia, political science academia, but I wasn't that really interested in political parties and in like how the government work. I was more interested in how human rights are being violated, how I, as a political science student, can also help the other persons to know more about their rights, about how we can fight them, how we can speak up and, basically try to protect them at all costs. And this is maybe the reason that I started, I joined Friday for Future. I said, no, if I have already the knowledge, not only to do activism, but knowing this strategic mindset of how we can organize to have a real and amazing and important goal that we need to reach, I said, okay, no, this is where I need to be. And yeah, this is how I got in this very chaotic world at some point, but we love it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Ayshka, do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, it was definitely a series of events that got me into activism. There was not like one point of time and I just got in and I'm like, oh, I'm a climate activist. I think it was back in March 2019, which was, I guess, the first Global Day of Climate Action. I remember seeing a lot of like pictures and videos on Instagram from Fridays for Future, and so many young people, going out, striking and demanding for actions to be taken. And that's what just really drew me to learn more about the climate crisis and how I can contribute to it. I got involved in some regional work such as Youth for Sustainability programs, and I started writing about environmental issues. It was sort of a way to let out the eco guilt and eco anxiety that I was feeling. But I never really felt like I had a place or I could, share my ideas and views in the climate movement, just because every time I saw, pictures and videos from the media that was surrounded around climate and youth climate movement, it was mostly people from the global north who happened to be white, and I couldn't find my representation that I wanted to see. I think it was fast forward to 2020 when the pandemic hit us and we all went to lockdown. People started to realize the privilege that came with taking physical actions, being able to voice out your opinions freely. And I can recollect on Instagram, I saw this post that said, go climate striking online, and I got really excited, like, oh, I can finally, do something with it. So that's how I came across Fridays for Future Digital, and how they use digital campaigns and digital strikes and digital engagements to provide a platform for people who doesn't have the privilege necessarily to take physical actions and be involved physically. Shout out to Iris and George, who are the creators of Fridays for Future Digital. I think, I think with that work, we were planning for the September 25th, 2020 Global Day of Climate Action. I was on a call and I met this amazing activist called Mitzi, who invited me to join Fridays for Future MAPA. And slowly, that's when I realized that I finally found my community. Even though Fridays for Future Digital started with George and Iris, who were two people from the US who started to strike digitally, soon like we grew into just like a huge movement with lots of people from all over the world. We started seeing representation from MENA, Middle East, and North Africa regions who couldn't previously, be actively involved in the climate action due to a lot of restrictions and, issues that face in their society. So that was just amazing. And yeah, I would be lying if I said, climate activism or being an activist was all just sunshine and rainbows, even though, working towards dismantling the system around us and fighting a crisis with your friends all around the world, just it's really different. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. For me, it came with imposter syndrome and burnout, and that was really, really awful. I was just so excited that I finally got into the space that I always wanted to be, and I just put in all out without knowing that it is a movement. It is we have to be sustainable, and I'm here in for the long run. And I should just like spread out my energy. And that's something I have been trying to do. One is to work towards inclusivity and accessibility so that more people like me, more people from the MENA region, and more people who couldn't necessarily be part of the movement now finally gets an opportunity to be involved, and also to just be vulnerable and speak out about issues such as imposter syndrome and eco-anxiety and activist burnout. So that's something that I kind of do, and I get to do that a lot with our podcast from FF Digital called Voice of the Youth. I think that's how I got connected with Tori and the Bad Actress Collective as well.
I can definitely relate to like not being sure how to get involved in climate action, even though like you care about it, you know about it, and you want to do something, but because it's so whitewashed, it seems really inaccessible. So I can totally relate to that, because it took me so long to get involved, because I was like, I don't know how, I don't see anyone like me doing this, so who am I going to ask? But I'm glad you've all made it here. But okay, so for people who are in FFF MAPA, or if you just have in general more knowledge about this, a lot of climate activists refer to the global south, obviously, and came together to reframe that phrase because it's very general as MAPA, so most affected people and areas. Can one of you explain what MAPA means, why it's essential that we recenter MAPA folks in the conversations and actions around climate justice, and I guess also, really going into detail what constitutes MAPA folks?
So MAPA, which stands for Most Affected People and Areas, is a collective noun that is used by people who are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, whether they live in areas that are prone to its effect, part of vulnerable communities, part of the less privileged, and or part of oppressive systems that affects their ability to effectively respond to the crisis. The most affected people and areas are also often the people who have been historically colonized and subjected to intersectional systemic oppressions. And these are, for example, the people at the front lines, such as the indigenous peoples who have been fighting for climate justice for a really, really long time, because simply their life depends on it, right? And it is very important that we center MAPA, and that's why youth MAPA activists, we formed Fridays for Future MAPA, and that's why we've started collectively mobilizing to put this message at the forefront of the climate movement to center the most affected people and areas, because the sad reality is that every time the selective media just, selectively spotlights white privileged activists, every time, global leaders push the climate crisis as some far of future problems, every time the stories from the front lines is just reduced to mere statistics and, a proof of resilience, people that are most affected continue to fight for a more just world. And if we really think about it, if we wanted just climate solutions, how can we get that if we continue to ignore the ones that are most affected? This means that, we have been mobilizing and we have been having more conversations. But what we also need to do, and we have started doing, is to actively and willingly make spaces for MAPA organizers, especially in leadership positions. That is, whether it's leading the movement or leading certain campaigns. We really need to hear their opinions and views, because they have been at this fight for very, very long. It's not that they weren't voiceless, but they were unheard. And if we don't spotlight them, if we don't listen to them, we're all just doomed.
I think as well, it's quite interesting that, people who are typically not considered MAPA and are like white activists who might be rich, cisgender, often white male, you don't know where they're from. Whereas if it's a MAPA activist, you do. And it just really reinforces how important like the environment is, as well as like the intersectional oppression that they face apart from being, say, poor or a woman or a person of color, like, because it is usually multiple. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point as well. And the next question I'm going to direct to Destiny. So Generation Green is Black youth-led intergenerational community that you are co-executive director of, and you've already explained a little bit. But you use the framework of environmental liberation. So can you explain to us what that means and looks like to you and Generation Green?
Yeah, thank you for that breakdown of MAPA also, Ayshka, because I've only come to recently hear that term, or I've heard it before, but I've never heard it broken down like that. And I don't even know if a lot of people who use it break it down like that, especially where you mentioned colonized people. I have to point that out, because I don't know if everybody defines MAPA like that. So thank you so much for breaking that down. In the term environmental liberation, yeah, I spoke to it earlier about, really affirming the need and the inseparability of environmental justice, climate justice, and Black liberation. And environmental liberation is a movement for and by Black people. And again, that is Black people everywhere across the African diaspora. I think we're really talking about identity here, or we've touched on it. And so in the context of my identity, I'm a Black woman. I'm in the US, so I'm also in the global North, which I'd like to point out that, both Black people, or really all three Black people on this panel right here, are from the global North. So that's a problem, and we need to ensure that we include folks who are from, I hate all these terms. I'm so sorry, being real, because labeling things is very much a white ideology, and I don't like it, but I understand, how we use them contextually so that people understand what we're referencing. So gosh, I hate this, but we need to be sure to include Black folks that are from the continent of Africa, that are from the Caribbean, and that are from what people deem as the global South, and how we're talking about here, MAPA. which in the context of how Ayshka explained it, it seems it can be people who are situated in Western nations, but that are also a colonized people within that. So I'm referencing to include folks who are not in those global north areas. But for environmental liberation, it's just really important to think in the context of my identity as a Black person, how has climate change affected my people, my community, and how does it affect me and my community today? And to that, I would say that, you know, many people up until recently, it seems to be like, you know, we're all in the house and having some sort of realization, awakening, radicalized, whatever. People said, you know, the climate crisis started with the Industrial Revolution. And that's not true. It's not true at all. It started much farther before that with the genocide of indigenous people in the Americas, and with the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, you know, stripping people and resources from the continent of Africa to line the pockets of wealthy, rich white families who still have that money today. Let's talk about that, you know, who still have that money today. And so that's how we have to view the climate crisis. And if we can't start with that foundational piece of where this started, then how can we have a movement that even creates a solution to it? And so that's like the baseline of environmental liberation, is noting that, one, the climate crisis started there. And then that noting that Black folks everywhere across the world are impacted first and worst. In the context of MAPA, it was, as it was mentioned, we are a colonized people. You know, even in the US, as a Black American, Black Americans are a colony within the United States. That is a whole track I'm not going down on this panel. But in the context of what a colony means and supplying neoliberal states, we are very much a colony in the United States, not to mention that across the diaspora, there are, you know, geographies, there are countries who have now gained their quote unquote independence from being colonized, but they're very still much in all of their resources are being extracted. Their economy is controlled by these nations, these wealthy nations who we all know are the biggest polluters and who continue to extract from us today in many, many ways, even in our movement work, you know, in the context of this white climate movement, extracting our labor, our time, our energy. And so when I think about environmental liberation, it is centered on Black liberation and what that means in all of its context. So it's extremely intersectional. We talk about how climate justice is housing justice, is energy justice, is racial justice, is gender justice. Same thing. Environmental liberation acknowledges all of that as its foundational piece. So it's not trying to shift a system or shift a movement. The movement of environmental liberation itself is founded on that principle that everything is intersectional and interdisciplinary and how it pertains to Black folks. And I think it's absolutely crucial, especially for Black youth, who we are, you know, even myself and my colleagues, we looked into this movement, or we got into this movement and was like, what the hell is this? You know, like, no, this is just not for me. This is not about me. This doesn't showcase me and my community and my people. And because of that, it is actually a barrier to us fighting for our lives, you know? And so it's like, I don't want no part of that. I very much want to be focused on my community and my liberation and the liberation of other oppressed people. I don't want to do performative celebrity activism. I don't want to be in a space that talks about centering my community, but really they're only extracting me and my labor to put my community on their grant report. You know, like I don't want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of the environmental liberation movement, which is for and by Black people, which is for me, which centers my life, which places that at the foundation and understands all those points of intersectionality and how we've historically, systemically been marginalized, been oppressed, and how climate change is genocide upon us. And so I hope that synthesizes environmental liberation, but again, it is very much a movement for and by Black folks, and that is not to be co-opted.
Yeah, I love that. And when you were saying about like ex-slave owner families still having the money, it's quite funny because in the UK in 2015, they finally paid off all of the debt they owed to slave owners, not slavers, not the enslaved people, slave owners. So I think since the late 1800s, taxpayers have been paying back slave owner families. until 2015. So that's wild. And also, yeah, go on, comment.
That's on that. Haiti, billions of dollars to France for their independence.
Yeah.
For their independence, and only recently finished paying that debt. And I was just in a room with the French ambassador to the U.S. who didn't even touch on that. Long story. But then also Belgium, genocide in the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the reparations for that? And so we talk about climate reparations. Also, all of that needs to be interconnected. And the UK wants to lead renewable energy. But where are the resources for the solar panels and stuff coming from? The Commonwealth, which are totally colonized places, which are still technically colonized. So, yes to that.
I could actually go on about this all day, but we have a time limit, so I'm going to move on. So, in the past few years, we have seen a huge reckoning in the environmental and climate justice space as people continue to highlight the history of white supremacy, colonialism, and imperialism in both the creation of the climate crisis, but in the environmental movement as well. So I'm going to direct this to Sofía. Where do you think we stand on creating a more inclusive and intersectional climate justice movement? What still needs to be done?
Yeah, so I'm going to say this as someone from Latin America. Like, here is a very complex region. Like Destiny already said, the Caribbean, for example, of Latin America. My country is based on Black slavery and indigenous slavery at every single country from the Americas, basically. We haven't still seen real justice. We, here in Costa Rica, Latin America, we have this holiday to value. I'm going to say this, how the government and how the society says this holiday, but basically it's to celebrate how we mix our races. So, and this is how they say it. And we know that this is basically celebrating genocide, indigenous and Black genocide here in the region. And this is something that's still happening. So when I joined the climate movement a few years ago, I didn't feel like I was being excluded. I don't know, even though I'm from Latin America, I would say that I'm white. I have this white privilege. But even though being from Latin America, I was always reading the news and was saying how, I don't know, we're watching the news and we see that all this spotlight there in in the US, in Europe, but what is happening in those colonized countries? Even though I'm not from I would say a vulnerable population itself, like my whole country, when we talk about renewable energies, and when we talk about lithium, for example, how do we get that lithium? By exploitation of the Latin American lands. We can talk about from Bolivia. Here in Costa Rica, we have BIT. So we're talking about even though I'm not part of the vulnerable community itself, I'm part of the vulnerable region, even though I'm not being affected directly. I live in the capital. Even though I have hurricanes passing by my country, not being affected, but this is something that we all should have solidarity, that when we talk about environmental liberation, we are not only talking about those who are already, say, I don't know, those in the global north communities and countries, those who are, polluting the environment, not protecting the environment, not only those who are like me, we are white, we're talking about everyone fighting for a single cause that is intersected. We're not only talking about environment. It is something that really shocked me at first, because when here in Costa Rica, we have this very going to the ecosystem protection kind of way of environmentalism. Like, we need to, if we protect the environment, if we protect the coastal areas, it's done. Like, climate crisis is not happening. Like, if we have clean, I don't know, oceans and whatever, done. Everything's gone. And we are forgetting that, for example, here to have renewable energy here in Costa Rica, this is something that if you see the news, you're going to see that Costa Rica is a green country, whatever. For do that, we need to exploit and basically steal indigenous land. We need to steal indigenous land right now to have, these big dams that we get our energy. And this is something that I would say, even though I'm not part of those communities, I would say I need to speak up at some point. Like, I'm part of that problem, I would say. And I know friends from indigenous communities that, they are being threatened. If they talk, they are going to be threatened. Yesterday, I went to this anniversary, like 2-year anniversary of the assassination of Sergio Rojas. He was an amazing hero, an indigenous community leader, and he was basically killed for the, this non-indigenous trying to steal their land people, and also the government, because we haven't seen justice. The cases are still open. Some NGOs and even the United Nations have talked about that, and we still haven't seen justice. And this is not a single case. We can talk about all the indigenous communities, all the Black, coastal, rural community here, not in my country, but worldwide, not being able to speak up, not being able to feel like they are part of this movement. We are seeing that we know that I would say the environmental and I would say the environment movement is not a thing that just started now. It's been for decades, for centuries. Like Destiny said, the climate crisis didn't started with the Industrial Revolution. It started with the genocide. It started when we saw that we need to accumulate wealth, that we need to have wealth for our own and not our own as normal civil society person. We're talking about those who just said that, they gain their wealth by slavery, by destroying nature, and they still do that. And this is, I would say that the climate movement and the environmental movement, what needs is to see environmental liberation, as Destiny said, as a black liberation, indigenous liberation, as gender issue, as a human rights issue. This is the only way that we're going to maybe not solve the climate crisis, because we know if we stop now, we're going to still see the impacts for a pretty long time. But this is going to be the only way to try to save humanity, at its best. And it's not like amplifying only white activists from my country, including me, is to amplify those who are already facing those effects, those who are unable to speak up, those who are living not only in facing a hurricane, but also a very complicated economical, political, and social conflict in their country. This is something that we need to talk about. That when we talk about climate, it's not only mitigate our emissions, it's about to have more environmental democracy, and we can't speak for our rights and speak for democracy if we're living in a very in a very conflict and problematic country with political and different issues. This is like a very complex situation. And as a political science student, I'm very complex about this. Like I always go to the academia diaspora, but this is basically putting human rights at the best, letting these people to speak up, not trying to steal their speeches, their work, is to let them speak. And this is the only way.
Domi, do you have any comments on that question?
Just adding, just adding on quickly about it being about, making an inclusive movement. Essentially, you guys put it perfectly, but having, collectively in this movement, there has to be deep understanding into environmental racism and the disproportionate impacts that it has on the crisis, and understanding into how these interconnected issues are so crucial and a part of climate justice, and not looking at it as completely separate, as just kind of just focusing on reducing emissions without looking at all of the, interconnected parts of that, of the climate and the environment. Because if we don't focus on this as a movement and we're not pushing for it, then what will happen is, we won't have equity in our solutions, and then we could end down the line that was kind of mentioned earlier, about having kind of these green revolutions happening in certain countries, and then the continuing exploitation of people in the most affected areas. And that is definitely not the line that we want to go down. We don't want communities that are disproportionately being impacted to still be impacted in that way, with no support there, and for people to be left behind. And that is just key, that people aren't left behind in the future of climate policies. You know, the climate action that we have, the green recovery that we have, it has to seek to eliminate social and economic inequality. Otherwise, we won't achieve climate justice. Yeah, we cannot continue this mindset of these like market-based solutions that people are pushing forward that continue to frame solving the climate crisis still around exploitation. It's not going to work. We have to reframe that mindset. We cannot continue to exploit exploitation of our planet, of our natural resources, of people. That has to end. And I think, yeah, that has to be at the heart of the movement if we really want to achieve climate justice.
Anyone else want to hop in on that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on with a point. As Fridays for Future, like as a climate movement, we have started seeing a lot of changes in terms of inclusivity, intersectionality, and accessibility. However, I believe that there's still we still need to identify certain echo chambers that exist and dismantle them. So when I speak about an echo chamber, it's basically a space where sound reverberates, right? And I think there are a few ways in which this idea can be applied to the climate movement. One is an example that I'm guilty of doing, is I find that as activists or as movements, sometimes when we communicate things outside of activist space, we forget to break it down and not stick to saying it in a very complex and technical manner. It can be something as simple as saying marker instead of most affected people and areas, or using a technical term but not breaking it down later. Things get lost in translation, and it just ends up as activists shouting into just like a void, right? It is not reaching anyone. There is no conversation happening. It doesn't get to the other side. Another thing that is due to an echo chamber is the fact that the movement doesn't become inclusive to a lot of people, because there are chambers or there are spaces where people put pressure on, say, individual carbon emissions, and maybe ban single-use plastics such as plastic straws. But there are a lot of people with disabilities who can't necessarily, who depend on single-use plastics, or a lot of people who can't necessarily reduce their individual carbon emissions. But due to echo chambers, there are people who genuinely believe that can be the solution to our climate crisis, which is, and this can perpetuate things like eco-ableism. And so it is very necessary that we dismantle this echo chambers and lead, allow our climate movement to diversify, and that would be having intersectional changes and having an intersectional fight. And addressing issues such as eco-ableism, addressing the fact that the environment can be racist. Environmental racism is a thing. Addressing the fact that the climate movement is a class issue, it is a gender equality issue, and that is when the movement becomes accessible and inclusive, and that is when we strive to just solutions. So I think that's one thing that our climate movement sort of lacks. We have started identifying, but we all need to come together really quickly and dismantle the echo chambers that exist in our climate movement.
I'd like to add to that and to kind of answer one of the Q&As in the chat. by just pointing out that in the context of making this climate movement more inclusive, intersectional, et cetera, it's really important to, and this kind of answers the question about, how to educate older generations, especially those in Western nations. I think we always have to look at things with an analysis and questions. If you can't question something, it's really concerning because things should constantly be evolving in a way that benefits folks, particularly in the case of climate and in social justice that are most affected. So I think just let's have an analysis of where are we? And I think we had a slight analysis of that last year during the uprisings, and it's continued to happen. But I don't know if anybody's taken a full analysis together in the context of where is money going? Where are resources going? Who is amplified? Who is showcased the most in the media in the context of climate? Where's the data being researched on? What's it being researched on and where? How accessible is that data? How accessible is all this information that, we're talking about and everything? And those are just some questions. There are many more questions, like who's leading the organizations that are controlling the funding? Who's leading the organizations that are always in the limelight? So these are a lot of important questions that should be a part of an analysis of where we are. And then there should be a want to move forward in the case of what the question was, how do we do that also? And it's answering those questions. And if there's a problem, which in almost all of those questions, there's a problem because the answer is primarily they're white or they're wealthy or there's a class or there's a gender problem there, then we should say, well, how do we shift this to centering and uplifting and sending resources or redirecting resources to those who are most affected? So in this case, how we've talked about it, MAPA, most affected people in areas. And I think that's how we shift, and that's how you also learn. You don't just learn by, people talking at you. You have to also come to the point where you can make your own analysis and, an informed analysis, let's say that, and where you're truly listening. Practicing deep listening is a way to learn, listening to those people who are most affected and to folks that come from areas that are most affected, like some of the folks on this panel today and many others that exist that are doing work on the ground right now. And that's something I would really like to point out is, again, not only are there not Black folks from what's classified as the Global South on this panel, there are a lot of organizations, primarily white and Western organizations, that are led in many cases by older generations, but there's a lot of youth organizations as well who go into Black geographies and very much outsource indigenous information and then kind of exploit that, or who very much use organizers and activists on the ground to get funding for their work and then not come back and source the communities that they're in. I've been meeting with several folks throughout the African diaspora, particularly on the continent, who have told me their firsthand experiences, and I see so many parallels across the diaspora. And I'm sure this isn't only happening in the Black community. I'm just able to speak because I'm a part of the Black community and I've had conversations and experiences with it. But I'm sure this is happening with MAPA folks all across the world, where we are resourced for our knowledge, for our experiences, and then we're not in return resourced for our own solutions. So that's a really important thing in learning. How can we, make this a more inclusive, a more diverse movement, is to actually learn from those who are most affected, the people and areas, because we are already creating our own solutions. We're not gonna wait for the white man to come save us. It's not gonna happen. And you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the system. So we have been figuring out our own stuff, for generations. And we'll continue to do so because we are often left behind. We don't want to be left behind, especially in this transition and the shift to a green economy and a green world, but we have been left behind, and so we've had to come up with things on our own, and that knowledge is indigenous to folks in those communities. So how do you make it more inclusive? How do you expand it? How do you make it better? Listen, don't extract, listen, and then resource. If you're in a position of power, if you're in a position of resources, and by resources, I don't just mean money, I mean land, I mean access to tools, to research, to data, redirect that. I don't know, that's my answer, and be very aware of, how you're moving, especially white savior complexes, which is something I was alluding to, but I didn't name it, so I'm naming it. White savior complexes, and also noting that people of color also have it wouldn't be a white savior complex, but it's a savior complex. And so just to have an analysis of those things and ask how, and then listen to be informed on the how.
Amazing. All right, I want to go for the last question quickly and hopefully answer one or two questions. Domi, so perfectionism is a tool of white supremacy to enforce white supremacy culture and patriarchal power structures. How do you show up as a bad activist? How are you imperfectly perfect? Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, when it comes to perfectionism, I think this also touches on a question that was asked about how tips for people getting involved in the climate movement that, you know, don't kind of overwhelm them. And I think, you know, perfectionism is a really big one. Trying to be what is seen as like a perfect activist or this one type of activist, that's not how movement is sustained. That's not how we grow. That's not going to be how we, you know, achieve climate justice. We did talk a bit earlier about what it means to be an activist or like an organizer, but perfectionism isn't something that you need to look at, you know, in yourself, because there will be moments you will make mistakes. You are always going to be learning, you know, ongoing. And perfectionism, kind of how you come across to others, you know, all of these things. I think it's also so important to remember that might, you know, lift a bit of weight off of your shoulders when it comes to perfectionism. And what I do is that, you know, this is all about collective action. This is about a much bigger movement. And sometimes when I find myself getting, you know, so into like the tiny details, whether it's on something that I'm writing or something that I'm speaking about or anything that I'm doing, you can lose track of, you know, the bigger picture. And so in that, it's just so important to remember that you are just part of a much bigger movement. You know, movements aren't created and sustained by one person or one type of person or led by one person. It's sustained by so many people all across the world, and you're part of a collective in that. And so you don't need to be perfect there. And I take that on as well. I don't need to be perfect. You know, I'm learning all the time. And when I first started out in this, I did have a lot of imposter syndrome, especially because I felt like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know how you sustain a movement. I have no idea how we're going to achieve this. But, you know, you keep going and you keep learning. And it's something that you really find out and get better at as time goes on. And just want to touch quickly a bit on engaging as well for new people, as well as, you know, not trying to conform to trying to be perfect. Also, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Also remembering that there are just so many different roles that are within the climate movement, although you don't always see them because you often see a certain type of activism presented or like celebrity activism presented. But there are so many people that are working incredibly hard behind the scenes that you don't see, that you won't see in photos. And, you know, all of these things, you need to remember there's so many different skills and experiences and things that you can offer to the movement. And that's so important. And I think once you break it down that way and be like, where am I best? What is, you know, what's most effective? What will help this movement most? Then that will definitely make things easier. You don't need to be doing all of these are kind of like massive things on like an international, even national level. We were talking about community. It's also about, you know, working in your community, working in your local community, your local group, being on the ground there. And so that's really important to keep in mind.
Amazing. I would love to go through some of the questions, but I think we're out of time now. But I kind of want to do this as a really like quick, everyone just has one thing to say, if you can. So how can we, as individuals, better organize ourselves to get our government to do things? So if I'll go, Ayshka, you're first on my screen. So if you just say like one thing, and then Domi, then Destiny, then Sofía.
I think what we do best can be used as a tool of advocacy. As Dominique mentioned before, there isn't one perfect way of advocating for change or being an activist. What you do best in finding like your purpose and trying to use that as a tool is something that I have done, and I think that's a way.
So for me, I would say as an individual, as I pointed out earlier, being as part of a collective, and there are so many individual ways you can push in that way that I can't go into now. Remembering the power of the people is so important. The system wants you to feel like, I can't do so much. I can only do this much. I won't have an impact. Yes, you can. Don't fall for the lies. The power of the people has been truly monumental in the past, and it will continue to be. So as long as we unite together and we stand up and we keep fighting, we will achieve what we want.
Yes, I want to build off of what Dominique said, because yes, there's no one right way. But in the spirit of what Dominique just said, collective power building, that is a very, very, very powerful tool. The power of the people united and organized, and then mobilized, as Kwame Ture would say, is very important. And that's definitely a big part of environmental liberation movement. Is we as Black people are in very many different geographies, but collectively, if we come together and see not only our differences, but our similarities and how we're being impacted in the same way and how the same actors are doing it to all of us, and then we unite and form an agenda, and then strategize about the agenda and implement it collectively, we're able to truly get things done to where we don't even necessarily have to depend on a neoliberal state or a government, but we can mobilize that within our own communities. It's a combination of both prongs, state negotiation and or dependence, and then also self-determination and community building. So those are two ways as well.
Yeah. So I would say, and also following the idea, I have a reason why I didn't got that involved and interested with political bodies, because I believe that the change is not in the government, it's in the society, it's in the power of people speaking up and destroying and dismantling the system, not the way around. The power and the movement starts with grassroots movement, with community movements, local movements. Is not, the government making policies, because the government is going to structurally exclude people that they are not interested to, be part of that change. So the change is not in those who are leading like the global leaders. The real change is in us. I would say, like, global leaders. The real global leaders are the grassroots movements, not the government. And this is something that not only to destroy the capitalism, because it's not going to help us to, save humanity, but also is to ensure democracy, ensure human rights. This is where the power of movement, and this is where I would say that we all should stand for, like doing individual, I would say the stuff, but also in terms that you are part of the collective. Like if we join and we have different voices at the same time with different perspectives, this is a massive and important way that we're going to change everything that is wrong today. It's not maybe not individual activism. It's you yourself. I don't know, you Destiny, you Dominique, doing and speaking up, but also not by yourself, like in a community. This is the only way that maybe, and I'm sure that is the only way that the power of people will, be heard at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you guys all so much. Thank you everyone who came to listen to us. This will be recorded. This has been recorded and will be available on YouTube, and you can share it and it's going to be captioned. I hope you learned something today. Some of the panelists have just dropped some of the recommendations into the chat. So please look, copy and paste, and they are great recommendations. Everyone have a lovely day, evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Bad Activists, for having us. Bye. I've got this.